In this week number 16 we are going over animations, and another word for animation is motion. And with motion we have already dealt with in last week, in which we have discussed the transition property, and we have seen that whenever the CSS values for an element change, then with applying a transition we can do those changes over time, meaning in motion. And therefore transitions are also considered to be animations. They are slightly different, and they are also often referred to as simple animations because we have less control over the motion that is going on here. So with the animation property, which is a shortcut for all the properties underneath, we have further control what's going on within the duration in terms of how the element shall look like. And also we have further control because we have further properties to which we have access to, by which, for example, we can repeat things all over again, we can pause and run things, we can run things backwards. Quite a number of features we further have here by making use of the animation property. And the animation property, we will be discussing the individual properties first, and then we are going into the shortcut, and then afterwards we are going into actual examples. Let's first of all take a look at that further control that we have within the duration by applying animations. Therefore, I have created here this orange box, and this orange box I have given just a couple of properties and their according values. For example, I've given it a width of 150 pixels, and for the background property I have given it a value in orange. And with transitions we know whenever the CSS values change for an element, we can do those changes over time. And one situation, for example, when the CSS values do change is, for example, when the mouse hovers over the element. So there we can change the value, for example, for the width to 600 pixels and then the background value to red. And that is exactly what is going on as soon as the mouse is going over the element. And whenever the CSS values change, we can apply a transition. All we need to set up here is a duration, because that one by default is 0 seconds. And that is exactly what's going on right now. It's just changing from one look immediately to the other look without going in motion. So therefore the transition duration is the only thing that we actually need to set up in order for things to go in motion, in order for things to change over time. So as soon as the mouse is now hovering over that element, things are changing within a duration of 5 seconds. So now with animations, we do have further control of how the element shall look like within that duration. So for example, we can tell the browser, hey, we want our element at 1 second, we want it to be in background in blue, and then at 3 seconds, for example, we want the background to be in green, and then ultimately at the end of the duration, we still want it to be in red and have its final width at 600 pixels. So where would that, for example, be useful, such control within the duration? And one example that we will be taking a look at in this week is the Santa Claus. And we want that Santa Claus to ultimately go to a location, run outside the box basically. And we want that to happen within a time frame of 1 second, within a duration of 1 second. And within that 1 second, we, however, want to change that background image. Or better said, as we will see, we will change the background position from this one to this one to this one to this one to this one, all happening within that 1 second. So here we definitely need that control within that duration. One example where animation would be very useful in this scenario. So let's take a look at how we set things up in order to achieve that control within the duration. And here what we are always doing, we are referring to the duration itself. So in this case we are dealing with the animation duration and not the transition duration anymore, which is however exactly the same thing, just for animation. And here we are setting up, we are referring to the duration, and then at that point, that is how we want that element to look like. So for example, we are referring to it always in percentage values, and then come those curly brackets just to divide things up for the browser. So it knows, now that is the end of the selection within the duration. Now comes what we actually want and how we want it. So for example, at 20%, referring to the duration, that is 1 second in our example. And here, for example, we want our element to have the following look. We want it to have a width of 300 pixels and we want it to have a background color, for example, in blue. And this is what we can do as many times as we want to. We can always refer to a certain location and then define a certain look for how that element shall look like at that given point within the duration. So for example, let's go for 80%. 80% referring to 5 seconds is 4 seconds. And there, for example, we want our element to look, we want it to have a width of 500 pixels, and we want it to have a background color in green. And then ultimately at 100%, that is the final look at 5 seconds at the end of the duration. We want the element now to have exactly that same look. We want it to have a width of 600 pixels, and also we want it to have a background color in red. So what we are actually doing here, we are referring to the duration, but somewhat indirectly. What we are actually doing here, we are referring to an image that is located at that location within the duration. Because animation, the proper word is not motion actually, it's the process of creating the illusion of motion. And we have seen it with videos. Videos are just an illusion to our brain. It's just made up of many individual images that are shown to us very quickly, one after the other, usually 20 to 30 images within 1 second, and that ultimately lets our brain perceive that quick showing of those images as if there was motion going on. So therefore, we are dealing here with many individual images when there is motion going on, and those individual images are referred to in its jargon word as frames. So what we are therefore selecting here is we are selecting that frame, that image that is located in our example here 20%, that is located at 1 second. That image, which is still our element of course, but it's now, since we are dealing with motion, it's made up of many images. So at that image, we want that image shall look in the following way. We want it to have a width 300 pixels and a background in blue. And that indirectly also influences the other frames that come previous to that 1 second. Because the browser, of course, it makes things smooth ultimately to look at 1 second like that one single image. So therefore at 19%, at 18%, at 17, etc., all the frames, the images that come before, they are marching towards that look at 20% already. And therefore we are not only influencing that one single image, but also other images that come before and also others that come afterwards. And therefore these frame settings here, we are referring to frames, but these are referred to as keyframes, because of that fact that they influence also other frames that and not only that one that is located at 1 second. And those keyframes we always include inside the CSS file. And whenever we include something, we know we are using the add symbol. For example, we have used it for including a font family by using add font face, or for example, we have used it for add import we have used to include other CSS files. So whenever we include something inside CSS, it's the add symbol. And in this case, we are including the keyframes. And the keyframes go right in here. Once again, we are making use of those curly brackets. And as we know, those curly brackets are just there because the browser needs an indicator. We know the browser in CSS removes all the white spaces by default, and if there was not a special symbol such as this curly bracket here, then things would move on top of each other. So this is always the separator here that is used in CSS in order for the browser to know what belongs to what, when comes what, and when ends what. Now that is all we need to do almost. There is one more thing that we need to actually accomplish in order for the animation to work. And that is because the keyframes are always located outside the element and on which we are applying the animation on. And the animation must be linked somehow to those keyframes, that this animation, the keyframes that are here belong to that animation. And therefore we have here another property, and that is the animation name. And by default, the value that's being used here is none, meaning there is no animation going on. And we can give it any value basically that we want to. all we need to do, we need to pay attention to, same as in HTML with those attribute values. For example, we cannot start with a number, no white spaces shall be used, and no crazy characters such as curly brackets or anything. But otherwise we are really free in order what we want to call it here, what value we want to use. Let me just call it XY for now, and that is exactly now that value that we are using here as well. So we are including the keyframes for the animation XY in this case. And that is it. The only question that is now remaining is, now when do those changes, when will those changes be kicking off? Now before we always had the situation when the CSS values change, such as for example once the mouse hovers over the element. Now with animation we have applied it at this given point right under the element. We will see later that the animation can of course also be applied on the hover rule. But in this situation what will happen if we only apply it on the element itself? It will just happen immediately when the page is loaded. So as soon as I reload the page now, those changes are kicking in. And we can see it's now changing to blue, to green, and ultimately to red. So after 1 second it's blue, after 4 seconds it's green, and then finally at the end, at the end of the motion, at the end of the duration of 5 seconds, the last frame, the last image that makes up that motion has then that look of red and a width of 600 pixels. And once the motion is over, whenever there is no motion going on, then the element will just look like it as we have defined it right here. Meaning at the end of 100% of 5 seconds, it will just jump back immediately to its original look that we have given to the element. We haven't defined a frame at 0% in order to tell the browser how that motion, the first frame, the first image that makes up the motion, how that one shall look like. And we have just seen, if we don't actually give a frame, define a frame, an image at 0%, then the browser will just take the original values as the base point, as how the frame, the image at 0% shall look like. And that is exactly where the motion is starting from that orange look and the width of 150 pixels and all the other settings that are applied right here. So if we don't give a frame at 0%, just the original values will be taken from the element. And same happens if we don't define a frame, an image, how the motion shall look like at the end of the motion. Same thing here. Once again, if we don't define it, then the original values that the element has will ultimately be taken as in order to make that image, that frame at the end of the location. So in this situation, therefore, without a frame at 100%, we are going to 80% where our element is in green and a width of 500 pixels. And then in the last 1 second, the last 20% of the duration, the last 1 second, it will just then in motion go to its original look back again. So let's take a look at this one, and we are going to the 80% in green, and then over the last 1 second we are marching back to its actual look that we have given to the element. So whenever we don't supply a frame at 0% or at 100%, then always the original look of the element will be taken in order to create that frame, that image. Let's actually make use of a frame at 0%. And let me give it here, for example, a width of 250 pixels, and let me give it a background in yellow, for example. And since we have now defined a frame at 0%, how that motion, how that frame at the very beginning of the motion shall look like, therefore the original values won't serve anymore as the first frame. And that means we are starting now at 250 pixels and a background color in yellow. So that is where the motion is starting, always when I reload the page. Right here, as defined in the first frame, where that makes up the motion, the first image that starts the motion, ultimately. Alternatively, what we can also use here instead of a 0% and a 100% are the keywords from, and the other one instead of 100% is to. So it's completely up to us whether we are using 0% or 100 or the equivalents from and to, but they do also exist so that we know, we sometimes occasionally see them out there, so we know what they are representing. So these are the keyframes by which we always determine how the element shall look like within the duration. Now let's take a look at two other properties that we have already seen in last week in regards to the transition. And one of them is the transition delay and the other one is the transition timing function. Let's take a look at the delay because with animation we have exactly that same property just for animation. And the animation delay, as we know, it just delays things and it does so whenever the motion is about to kick off, about to start, then there will just be a delay by the value that we define. The default value, as we know, is 0 seconds. So no delay at all. Now at this given point, as soon as we reload the page, 2 seconds delay and then things kick off and things start to change over time in motion. One thing that I haven't mentioned last week is that we can actually also use negative values here. So for example, negative 2 seconds, and what that causes the browser to do, it will jump immediately to 40% of the animation in our case, because to 2% of the animation. So how that element looks at 2 seconds. So that is where it immediately jumps to. Here we can see it at 2 seconds, it looks like this. So that is also possible. What we can do by using the delay, we can also apply negative values right here. Now the next one is the animation timing function. And this one was a little bit more detailed last week, what we had to discuss there. So the keywords that we can use here that make things smooth are ease, that's the default value. Then there is ease in, ease out. Then there is linear, which always goes at a steady pace. So in general, what we are defining here, how smooth the changes shall happen. And we cannot only make things smooth here, all the smooth keywords, ease in, they ultimately get converted to the cubic Bezier function values as we have seen. And we cannot only make things smooth here, we can also use the steps function, steps in how many steps we want to go instead of going smoothly. And also we have seen the step end and the step start. So these are the values here for. So everything is the same as with transitions. There is only one single difference, and that is this timing function, the easing that we are giving here, will always apply to each keyframe that we set up. So in this case, ease. What ease is doing, once again, let's take a look at this one. That is the ease, and we know the values inside the cubic Bezier function are just the coordinates of point 2 and point number 3 here as discussed. And those coordinates ultimately determine how a Bezier curve looks like. And the flatter the curve, the slower the animation, the slower the progress will go on within the duration. So in this case, with the ease value, we are ending a little bit slower, while at the beginning it's slightly slow and then it speeds up and then it goes slow. Meaning in our scenario, if we are using that default value ease, then we are always slowing down towards the 20%, towards the 80%, as well as towards the 100%. That is the only difference here, that things will be applied to each and every keyframe that we have set up here. So let's take a look at our element actually once again. And after the delay period, here we are slowing down towards blue, then towards green it's slowing down, and then it goes to red and slows down at the end as well. So to each keyframe, the timing function, the easing is getting applied ultimately. Now if we want that to be different from one frame to another, it's not a problem. We can just apply it right here as well. So animation timing function, and then whatever value we are using then here for the animation timing function will then be applied in between or towards the next frame. So it will then, whatever we ultimately define, it will slow down or speed up or whatever it is. So here we also have that control of what is going on with from one keyframe to the other in terms of smoothness. One thing to pay attention to also with the easing is, for example, that is our first example later on will have that feature where we want things to go always at a steady pace. And we know the linear keyword, that is ultimately this one that causes that curve to have a straight line, always go at the same speed from the beginning of the motion to the end of the motion. So linear always gives us that same speed throughout. The only thing here is, once again, because the easing, that value, is now being applied to each frame, and here the proportions between the duration and the change must of course always be the same. If we take a look in a moment at our element once again, then we will see that here the distance to cover, or the duration here from 20 to 80% is converted, that is 3 seconds. Here we have 3 seconds time in order to change 200 pixels. Now from that frame to this frame we only have 1 second time to change 100 pixels. So it must go faster from this frame to this frame in order to finish, of course, after 5 seconds. So here the proportions between the duration and also between the duration and the change to accomplish must, of course, always be the same in order for us to really have always steady motion going on throughout the animation. Let's take a look at the 80 to 100% frame here. It will ultimately speed up. Let's take a look at this one, delay period. And then linear, it's going at a steady pace, and then it speeds up here towards from green to red ultimately, due to the fact that it has to change more within a shorter time period. So we will have an example in a moment in regards to that, but that is also something to pay attention to. Now there is one more property that we will not be applying right here. However, that one we have discussed last week, and that is the property transition property. And we have seen with that property we can control of which properties will change. We can exclude properties from changing over time, and we can also define different settings for different properties. For example, different durations for different properties to change, or different easing, for example, or different delay. So for different properties we can apply different settings, and however this property we do not have here. So there is no animation property here, right here. And the reason is very simple, because the entire control is given to us, first of all, inside the keyframes itself. If we don't want the width to change, we just remove it, for example. And also if we want a different transition to go, a different easing to go on, we just apply it right here as just discussed. So all we need to do is apply a different timing function here. And also in regards of the duration, we do have control, and of all things in general, because we can use multiple animations as well. So all we need to do, once again, divide things up by comma and then give it a second name, and then include second keyframes for that animation. So in this case, for example, we are including the keyframes for the animation ZZ, also applying to that element in this case. And then in here we can define whatever we ultimately want to as well. Some properties shall change differently. So for example, let's go 50%. And in this case, for example, the height shall change to ultimately 200 pixels. So we can apply different things, and we have the complete control of what property receives what duration, what delay, and what easing. Since here, same as in last week, we can also divide things up by comma and then tell, for example, here 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds are now referring to ZZ, to that animation, meaning to our height as we have defined it right here, and the 5 seconds is referring to the other one. So the height is now changing over a duration of 2 seconds, everything else is changing over the duration of 5 seconds. So we do have that complete control already right here by using the keyframes within the keyframes, and also by applying multiple animations. And therefore there is no animation property, it's just not needed anymore. Let us now go into other properties that we have access to. We have now seen that we do have, with animation, we do have further control, because we can define how the element shall look like within the duration. And secondly, we also do have further control just for the fact that we have further properties that we can use. And one of which is, for example, the animation iteration count, by which we can define how often the animation shall be repeated. And therefore, let me reduce the delay here for a moment so we can see the changes a little bit quicker. And all we need to apply here is a number, nothing else. For example, iteration is another word for repetition. How often do we want it to be repeated? 2 times, 3 times, 99 times. Usually when it's such a large number, the better value to use here is a keyword value that we have access to, and that is the value of infinite. That will just, as the name implies, it will repeat the animation over and over and over again as long as the person is visiting our website. Let us now go for a value of 3, for example. And let me reload the page. Now 1, 2, 3. and then it goes back once the motion is done and all the repetitions are done and the durations, then it goes back to its original look, since always the original look is being applied when there is no motion going on. When the motion is over, original look comes back. However, at this given point, what is going on, it always goes to the last frame, then goes back to the first frame, then to the last frame. So it goes from 0 to 20 to 80 to 100, and then it jumps back to 0. So it does not go back to 80, 20, 0. Instead, at this point, it jumps back to 0, and then the second repetition starts all over again. And then it jumps back, and then third repetition, and that's it. And the motion is then over, and then it goes back to its original look that we have given to the element. Now that is what we also have control over by using our next property. And this one is the animation direction. And here we can define whether we want things first of all to start at the end or at the beginning. By default, things are starting at the first frame, because the value that's being used here is normal. Now alternatively here we can use reverse, and that is telling the browser, hey, start at the last frame and then go back to the first frame. Let's take a look at this one after the delay period 1, 2, 3, exactly the same, just the way backwards. Now what we can also tell the browser to go back in the same way as you have gotten there. So for example, in our scenario right now, we are going from 100 to 80 to 20 to 0, and then we are jumping back to 100. And then everything starts again. So we can also tell the browser, hey, go back to 80, 20, 100, and then go 20, 80, 100. Don't jump to the beginning frame again, or in our case, the last frame, due to the fact that we have things reversed. So go in turns, basically. And that is what we can accomplish by using reverse alternate. Reverse alternate, and that ultimately gives us that 1, 2, and 3, which is not giving us that one, because it's the other way around. Alternate reverse. So let me just change this one, alternate reverse. And here we can see now it goes back, and then it goes forwards again and back. So we are now going in turns. So what is going on here? Since we have things reversed, we are starting at the last frame, then we are going to 80, to 20, to 0, and instead now of jumping back to the beginning frame, we are going back in the same way, which is then also considered to be a repetition, so an iteration count. So here we can see we are going now from 100% to 0, forwards, second iteration count, and now third, that's it. So it's also considered to be a repetition. Now what we can also do here is just use alternate. And alternate, here we are not going reverse, we are still starting now at 0. So exactly the same thing, now we are just starting at 0, going to 100 over 20, 80, 100, and then to 80, 20, 0 instead of jumping back, and then again 20, 80, 100, and that's the third iteration count. So let's take a look at this one. So we are going forward, starting at frame 0, going to 100, and then going back to 0 in turns, always over each keyframe and not jumping back to the first keyframe that we have applied. Let's take a look at our next property that we have access to. Because at this given point, if we are running alternate, we are going forwards, we are going backwards and then forwards, and then the motion is over, it goes back to its original look. So what we can also define is we can tell the browser when the animation ends at 100% right here, where our element is in red and has a width of 600 pixels, stay exactly at that look of the last frame as we have defined it right here inside the last frame. And that is what we can control by making use of the animation fill mode. And fill mode, in my opinion, it's a little bit a vague naming convention here. So fill mode, what it actually is meaning is how shall that frame, how that makes up the motion, that image, how shall that one look like, how shall it be filled with what CSS values? Shall it be filled when the animation ends at 100%? When it's over, shall it be filled with the original values again, which are actually always used when there is no motion going on, or shall it be filled with the settings under the last frame? And here we can define, for example, forwards. And with this one, now we are staying at the last frame when it ends there. So 1, 2, 3, third iteration count, that's it. Now we are staying there. And we are not, since the motion is actually over, it would go back to its original settings of the element. but due to that keyword that we have given here for the animation fill mode, forwards stay at the look of the last frame. And there is also another feature that this one controls, and that is when there is a delay period going on, as it happens to be in our case of 1 second. Then during that delay period there is no motion going on, the motion has not yet started. Therefore, during the delay period, the element just looks like in orange as its original look. Once the delay period is over, things start to change, of course. And here we can define, for example, whether during that delay period the element, the element shall already look like as the first frame that makes up the motion. So, and here we can use the value backwards. So that is that only has an effect when we have a delay period. And we have defined a frame at 0%. And then here we can see it's already yellow. It already has the look as we have defined it inside the first frame. Now if we take a look at the animation now, so we are starting already at the first frame within the delay period. But now when the animation ends at 100%, it still jumps back now. So our other feature is now gone that we have accomplished by using forwards. But we can also have both features by just using that value both. And now we are starting already at the first frame during the delay period. And once the animation ends at 100%, we are also staying there at that look as defined under that keyframe. The default value that's being used here is none, and that tells the browser exactly that behavior that we had right before. So when the animation ends at 100%, it will go back, motion is over, it will go back to its original look, and also during the delay period it will take its original look and not the look that we have defined under the first frame. So that is what the keyword none is causing. It's the original effect. Let's go for the last one, and that is the animation play state. And with this one, we can determine whether the animation shall be running or whether it shall be paused. And the default value is in fact running, and we can pause it. For example, let's go for the example when the mouse hovers over the element, then we want the animation to be paused. And that is exactly the second value that we can use here, paused. And now animation starts, mouse goes over in our scenario, and then the animation will be paused. And of course with JavaScript later we can pause the element whenever we want to. Same thing, we can kick off the animation whenever we want to later. We are then not just restricted to when the page is loaded, as it always happens in our case right now. So these are all the properties, and all of these properties are part of the shortcut, and the shortcut is animation. So as always, and here let's just use exactly the same ordering as we have done it right underneath. Linear, 3 iteration counts. We want things to go in turns, alternate, and we want things to start at the first frame during a delay period and also end at the last frame when the animation ends there. And we want things to be running, even though that's the default value, one that we actually don't need to specify, just for the sake that we have that we can see all of them inside the shortcut. So let's take a look once again at the animation. It's exactly happening exactly the same behavior, of course. The only difference is that we have used one line of code instead of multiple lines of code. And what we can also do here, we can once again divide things up by comma and then use a second animation here. So as many as we ultimately want to. Now in terms of the ordering, I am one more comment here. So what is always required when we are applying an animation is the name. Always. That's a must. Now the duration usually in almost all situations is a must as well, since by default that is 0 seconds, and therefore there is no motion, no timing, no time over which the motion can occur. So the duration basically is also a must, those two. And that is exactly the order that we must meet. So the name shall always be the first and the duration shall be the second. However, we order the other ones, so we can move things around here as completely up to us as we want to, but the first two must be the same, because with the other ones things never collide. So here that is the animation fill mode, and those values are both forwards, backwards, and none. And here we have either a number, how many, the iteration count, or infinite. Here we have alternate, reverse, and normal. And here we have the easing keywords, linear, ease in, ease out, etc., running, paused. So always a different value is being used for the properties, and therefore the browser can always figure it out which value belongs to which property. There is only one collision here actually, and that is between the duration and the delay. In both situations here we are using a value in seconds or in milliseconds. So it could be both in this case. How does the browser know? As I just said it, it's always the duration must be the second value. And therefore the browser knows this is the duration, and therefore the delay must be the other one. So here the browser can still figure it out. And still things happen exactly in the same manner. So the order is completely up to us actually. That one here is just the regular order. So how things are usually done. But it's up to us. So that's now the individual properties and the shortcut. Let us now go into actual examples. And the first example that we want to take a look at is that bubble right here. And this bubble, we want to move that bubble around. And first of all, let's take a look at the setup. So we have a container box here, and we have this bubble right inside that container box. So inside our HTML code, we have one container box, which is this one. This bubble inside has no content purpose at all. So HTML is in charge of content, CSS is in charge of the appearance, so including stylistic things. And therefore, because this element has no content purpose, only stylistic purpose, therefore, in order once again to divide the languages up, HTML, what it does, and CSS, the better way in creating that element, even though it's not a must, is doing that in CSS by creating a faked element using either the before or the after selector. So what that one will do, it will just select the parent, which is that container box here, and inside here it will create either a faked element at the beginning or at the end as first child inside here or as last child. So it's not a must, but it's usually done this way, and it always goes together with the content property. Now, what value do we want to change here? If we want that bubble, for example, to move around wherever ultimately, then what we can do, we can change the left value, the top, or the other ones, right and bottom. We could also change the margin, for example, margin top or margin on the left, to ultimately bring that bubble to a different location inside here. Now, I would argue, let's still take it out of the flow, irrespective whether we are using the margin or the top, right, bottom, or left. Because usually there is other content inside here, and if we are not taking it out of the flow and we are changing the margin for this bubble here, then this ultimately, the further the bubble moves to the right, then the other content here is influenced as well and also needs to move further to the right. And if the bubble is right here, the other content has to move down ultimately. Since there is no more space, things are in the normal flow. So we take the element out of the flow. That is the first thing that I would argue to do. So therefore we take the element here, the bubble, out of the flow by setting it to position absolute, and it shall be relative to its parent. So when we are using values for top, right, bottom, left, or when we are using percentage values for width and height, then this bubble will always be relative to its parent and not to another parent or the viewport. So therefore, our bubble is position absolute and its container box is position relative. Now the other settings are just to create the bubble, stylistic settings here. And now what we want to do is we want to apply an animation, and we want that bubble to ultimately move to three other locations. First we want it to go down here, then up here, and then down here. And the distance to travel shall always be the same, and we want that bubble to always travel at the same speed. And what we want to happen is once the bubble ends right here, then actually we want it to start right here, even though it is right here at this given point. Ultimately it shall run in reverse. We want our animation to run in reverse. it shall also go in turns. Once it reaches here, the frame at 0%, then ultimately it shall go in the same way back as it has gotten there. And we also want that to be repeated an infinite number of times. Therefore, first of all, let's go for the things that we definitely need to set up. And the first thing here for is the animation name. And let's just call it any name, flying bubbles, for example. And let's immediately also apply the duration, since that is actually also something that we need to set up. So a duration in order for a motion to go on in the first place, since by default that is 0 seconds. So let's go for a duration of 5 seconds. And let's go for the keyframes, which are a must, of course, as well. So we are including the keyframes for the animation with the name flying bubbles. And then those curly brackets in order to divide things up. And oh, sorry. And inside here, we are now defining the actual frames. The question is, which frames do we need? So our element at this point is at this location, which is fine. Let's leave it there. That's okay. So we don't need a frame at 0%. Since if we don't give a frame at 0%, then just the original values will be taken. So 0% is, we don't need that one. Then we want the element to be here, here, and here. And we therefore have 3 different locations. But the point here is we want things ultimately to always go at a steady pace. And therefore the proportion between the duration and the change that happens must be equal, the proportion must be the same in order for things to go at a steady pace. And therefore let's just set things up exactly in the same manner, same duration, same change within that duration. So let's go for 33%, for example. Let's go for 66%. And now the final value shall be 100%. So, and in here, always the same change shall happen, the same amount of change. And what we want to change first, we want to take the option with the margin that we have. And the margin is right now at the top margin 0 and on the left margin 0 at this given point. And let's change the margin at left first, at the left of 200 pixels. And we want the margin also to change from the top 200 pixels. So we are changing from 0, we are going horizontally to 200, somewhere right here. And vertically we are going down also to 100. So that is the distance that we are covering. And that must of course also be the same distance to be covered here. So we could here go for margin left 100 pixels and margin top 300 pixels, which would be exactly the same distance. Still, in total it would be 400 pixels. Let's just keep it simple though, let's make it equal. And let's go here for 400. So again, we are covering a distance horizontally of 200 pixels from 2 to 400. And from the top, we want to go now to 0, back to 0 again. So again, it's a distance of 200 pixels. We are going from 200 again, we are going down to 0. Now right here, let's go for our last frame. And here we want to be from the left 600 pixels. So horizontally away somewhere here. And from the top, we want once again to be away 200 pixels. So again, it's a distance to cover vertically 200 pixels and horizontally, once again, it's a change to cover of 200 pixels. So the proportions, it's always the same duration and the same changes that happen within the duration, which is the precondition in order to give us, to achieve a steady duration. A second thing that we need to do, of course, is apply the animation timing function, since by default the value that's being used here is ease. And that ultimately slows things down at the end. Let's go for the keyword linear, which always goes at the same pace. And that now gives us exactly that behavior. We always go at the same pace. What I've given the container box already is overflow hidden. So whenever the bubble is actually going outside, overflowing the box, then it will not be visible. Now what we want to achieve is we want that bubble to we want to start from that position. So we do not want to start from 0%, which is the original look, since we haven't defined a frame at 0%. We want to start at 100%. Also, what we want to accomplish when we are then going to 0%, then we want not to jump back to 100 and start all over again. We want ultimately to go back in the same manner. So again to 33, 66, 100, and then back to 66, 33, and then 0. And also we want that to happen an infinite number of times. So what do we need to apply here? First of all, let's go for the infinite number of times. That is animation iteration count, repetition counts. And here we can use a number, or alternatively iteration count, or alternatively this keyword here, infinite. And that is exactly in this situation what we want to use. Now let's go for the in turns. We want to go in turns. Let's go for the animation direction. And with the direction we can define whether we want things to start at the end and also whether things shall go in turns. And that is that double keyword here, alternate reverse. Alternate reverse. Alternate reverse. So that is accomplished now, and let's take a look what is going on. We are starting from the back. We are doing that now an infinite number of times, and we are always going in turns throughout the animation, and it will always go on ultimately. So that is our first example. Let's go to our next example. What we now want to achieve, actually now let's stay with that example for a moment. And let's do the exact same example with just different properties for a moment. So let me change those ones to top and left. And that should actually work as well. We have access to those properties because we have taken the elements out of the flow. Let me reload the page and things are still working. However, let me reload the page. Things are still working. It goes back and once again it continues on. So things are still fine, left and top, the values are kicking in, exactly the same behavior. So we either have one option or we have the other option, completely up to us. One thing I want to point out though, and that is when we are starting at 0%. So we want now to go from 0, from the first keyframe to the first, then the second, and then the last, and then go backwards. Then things are not working anymore. And why is this the case? And that is because we should always define left and top right here as well. For margin, if we don't define it, it's same with transitions. Then what will happen? How will the top and the left value be if we don't define anything? It will be as the browser defines it, either if the browser has defined something in his default style sheet. And sometimes that is the case in terms of margin, for example, unordered lists, for example, or headline elements, H1, H2, or for example, paragraph elements, the P element. Those ones, they have margin being applied already on them. But usually for all the other elements, there is no margin, and in particular not on faked ones, because faked ones the browser doesn't even know. It cannot give them a default appearance because these are faked elements. So there is definitely no default appearance going on by the browser that the browser does in his own default style sheet. But when the browser does not define anything, then the initial values kick in that the W16 defines, which once again are all the browser companies together, basically the entire industry, on which they have defined how an element shall look like if the browser does not change it, and if we, of course, do not change it either, or the user ultimately as well. So therefore the initial values kick in here for the margin, and the initial values in this case for the margin are margin left or top, doesn't matter, is always 0. Now the problem here is the initial value that kicks in for left and top. Left by default, if we don't specify anything, the initial value is auto, and that is one value that the browser cannot work with. So therefore we need to set it to 0 in order for the browser to have a value to work with. Auto is automatically, the browser, it cannot work with it. So it's hard, it doesn't work. Therefore the animation is not kicking off in this case. So that is something to pay attention to. When we don't define something right here, then the initial values will be taken, or the default values, depending whether the browser uses some values for certain properties. So that is something that we have seen, for example, also with last week with width and height. If we don't define them, then the value that's being used is auto. And whenever there is auto, we cannot do things over time. The browser does not know how to divide up the duration with an auto value. It doesn't work. So therefore, we had to use max width and max height, for example. Let me now give it a top 0 here and let me read out the page. So here's the bubble. Now it's working again. So that's something to consider, something to pay attention to. Now finally, let's go into the next example, and that is our Santa Claus. And this Santa Claus, we want him to move to the end of the box. So here is the center, and that is actually not an image in HTML, because we can only change CSS values. So therefore I have given it a background image. So the Santa Claus is just inside another box. And that box in which the Santa Claus is being set as a background image, that box is inside another container box. Let's take a look at the setup right here. So that is the container box, which is the grayish one. And then here is the center. Once again, actually the center would only be there for a stylistic purpose. It has no content purpose. But we will be making use of 2 more elements in here. Once again, also those 2 have only stylistic purpose. And we can only, a maximum of faked elements that we can create are 2. Which is because we have only the before and the after pseudo element selectors. So therefore I decided to just insert them right here without using the before or the after pseudo element selectors. But once again, we have exactly the same setup. 1 container box, and then there is 1 box inside which has the Santa Claus being set as a background image. And we want that box in which the Santa is inside, we want it to ultimately end up right here. We want basically to let the Santa Claus walk out, and that's it. And then we want him to stay there. Stay there, that's it, animation is over, done. That's what we want to accomplish. So in order to get him there, first of all, what we can change, once again, is the margin. Let's, however, go for the left value. So we want him to change from left right here, and then how do we get him there? Left 100% gets him there in a scenario, of course, where the container box must be position relative. So the center box must be relative to the container box. The center box is position absolute, container box position relative, and then we can move him outside. The width of the container box is 100%, so from the left, 100%, that's where we want the center to be ultimately, right outside the box. So let's take a look at the CSS setup that we are dealing with here, which is right here. So container box overflow set to hidden, so the center won't be visible once it is outside, position relative. And now the center itself, here the left value already being set, since that otherwise by default is auto. So again, to pay attention to. And here the center is position absolute. Now let's set up the animation and what we need to define here. So first of all, what we need to do is animation name, center, that's whatever we want to, and a duration, it shall happen within 1 second. Now the keyframes, as we can see here, there are quite a number of them. And always the left value is changing a little bit. But what we also want to change is, within that 1 second, as mentioned already in the beginning example in this week, in this video. So we want to change the background position here inside that image. This one is, we can maybe remember, a so-called sprite. A sprite is just an image with many other images. And here we can ultimately define, we can get a snippet of this entire image of only a certain part, meaning of only 1 single image inside here. What we therefore need to do, we always need to define a certain width here and a certain height. And then we define just where that snippet now, where that box shall be positioned. So in order to then only see, for example, that part of that image. So therefore, we always need to ultimately change in the keyframes. We need to change the width and the height, because that one is always different depending on the image. Here the legs are spread a little bit further, so the image is wider. So the width and the height are different, and the background position. Those 3 things we also need to change. And we can always find those informations out. Maybe we still remember that website, otherwise it's in the notes. So here, that's on this example website, all we need to do, we can mark it, and then it gives us the width and the height and the background position of this certain location where this image is located within the sprite. So this is what we need to do under the values, first of all, the properties and the values that we need to change inside the keyframes. And since we are dealing with 9 images, we have 9 keyframes, 9 different background positions will be changed together with the width and the height. And we are also going always a little bit further from the left away, ultimately reaching left 100%, where the center is then right outside the box. So let's take a look what is going on right now. And here the Santa Claus is walking already, but doesn't that look strange? So let's take a look at the property animation timing function. Here we can define how smooth things shall go, or whether things shall go smooth at all. Let's first of all go for linear. Things shall go smooth at the same pace. But what we are actually seeing here is we are exactly seeing what is going on when the background position is being changed from here to here to here to here, and that is exactly what we are seeing over time at this given point. So we don't want things to go smooth in our case. And that is now our first real example where we can make use of the steps function, or at least the first example in this course. And the question is, how many steps do we want to take? We don't want things to go smooth, we want things to go in steps. And we know that the timing function is always being applied to each and every keyframe. And at each keyframe there is one different image being displayed, meaning there is one step always that we want to take. We want to go in steps 1, and that gives us the result. Now the center is walking at this given point. Once the animation is over at 100%, then what happens by default? It goes back to the original look that we have given to the element. And that is what we want to change. We want the center to stay there, right there. And that is what we can do by letting things stop at the last frame at 100% using that animation fill mode property, which naming convention, as mentioned, I'm not completely happy with. Neither am I actually too happy with the keywords that we are using here forwards, but it's a preference thing, I guess. That's what the W16 came up with. So forwards. Now that's it. Now it's ending at 100%. At that look, it will not go back to the original look that we have given to the element. So that's our center, and that was our second example. Now let's take a look at, or let's ask the question, why would it be possible to change the image if those images were single images and not located inside a sprite? So what we could we change the background image? And that is not possible. Almost any property can be changed, can be animated, meaning can be changed over time. However, background image is not one of them. Due to a simple reason, a reasonable reason, because here with background image we are always going to the server. This is a path to the server. And let's assume that we are located in Australia and we are visiting a website that has this Santa Claus animation. And that animation goes on within 1 second. However, we are located in Australia and the server where the website is located is, for example, in Central Europe. Now, that is, of course, first of all, quite a long distance to travel in order to get that image from that other computer, that server in Europe. And then also, secondly, there might be a lot of traffic. Secondly, then the server might be a slow one. So we can certainly not guarantee that all images come back in order to accomplish that animation. The simple reason here, background image cannot be animated. And other properties that can, for example, not be animated is, for example, visibility. Since visibility, the values that we can use here is hidden or visible, and that is either or. There are no middle steps to which the browser can change to over time. It's either visible or it's not. Or, for example, the display property cannot be changed either, since it's none or it's block or it's inline block. That these are not values that can be changed to over time. But usually most of them can. Here is a list with all those properties. And many of them we have already worked with, such as max height, max width, margin, left, font size we have seen has a little bit buggy behavior in Firefox, border we have worked with. So most of them we have actually worked with. Not all of them can, but usually it makes immediately sense whether they can or whether they cannot be animated, changed over time. It either has a problem with the server, in our case, with the background image, or for example, it's just a value that cannot be animated because it's just either it's visible or it's hidden, for example. It's either or. There is no middle way, even though visibility is actually being listed here, but it doesn't work. And that list is actually also not complete. And because the transform property, which we are discussing next week, for example, is not being listed here. So it's a little bit outdated, this list here. Still, I have attached it to the notes that we can download. So that's our second example. Let's now go into our next example. First of all, let me outcomment the center so there is less motion going on the website. Now what we want to accomplish here is we wanted to let it snow inside this box. So what we therefore need is a background image with snowflakes. And of course that image must be a PNG image with transparency. Otherwise there would be a white area here and the snowflakes would not be visible. So here are the individual snowflakes, a little bit hard to see, I guess, due to the background color that's being applied here. But there are quite a number of snowflakes, and those ones we want ultimately to come down from the top. So where do we apply this image on as a background image? On the container box maybe? And then maybe give it a background position of left top maybe, and then change the background position to bottom right. But once it reaches that position, what then? Shall we go backwards again, then the snow goes upwards? Or shall we start from the beginning again, but that would be an interruption in the motion, which would not be nice. So the background position is not the solution in this case. And therefore, what we will be doing now is we will be creating another box inside the container box. So the center clause gets another sibling, another box inside here. That's the container box, that's the center, and here will be another box, and that one shall also be out of the flow, position absolute, and it will therefore be relative to its parent right here, which we have given position relative, and it shall have also the same size, so width 100% and height 100%. Let's take a look actually inside right here. So width and height 100%, position absolute, and we want to move it away from its location, from being on top of it, right on top of the box actually. So we do so by just bringing it to the top by the value of the height of the actual container box. So it is negative, of course, because we are going upwards. So negative 250 pixels. That's the height of the parent in which the box is inside. So right here we want that box to be, and then we will be animating it so it ultimately ends down here, right here underneath the box. So right underneath, that's what we want to do. Let's take a look at this box. Let me actually give it a background color in blue so we can actually see it. And we want to animate it now. We want to bring it down to this location right here. And therefore, let's set up the animation. What we need to do is animation name. Let me call it snow, and an animation duration as well. And let's make that happen over a duration of 5 seconds. And let's set up the keyframes, add keyframes for the animation with the name snow. And now the question, what keyframe do we need if we really want that box now to go from its current location to go right here? What do we need to do? Its current location is fine, so therefore we do not need a keyframe at 0%. It shall start where it is, it's absolutely fine. And we only want one different location, and that is underneath, and that's its ultimate location, meaning at 100%. That's the only keyframe that we need. 100%, and there we want it to be at the top 250, now positive instead of negative in pixels. Let's take a look at this one, and here it is snowing now. And however, as soon as the blue box is completely over its parent box, then it stops snowing. It stops, and then we could start it again, but there will always be a period where there is snow, where there is no snow falling. So therefore, first of all, let's let it repeat over and over again. Animation, iteration count, infinite, and let's now create a second box exactly at the same location. And this second box shall come in with a delay right when the blue box is at this given point, right when it's right here. That's where we want then the second box to start. And that second box, once again, will also have the snow as its background. So let's give it a second box here with exactly the same settings in green, so it's right on top now. However, that green box, we want to delay it. Animation delay by 2.5 seconds, which is half of the duration, and that should be the time then when the blue box should be over that box, then the green box can come down. However, that is not yet correct because of the animation timing function that by default is ease, meaning it's slowing down in the end. So it's faster in the beginning, so we want things to go linear. Then things are really at this stage. 2.5 seconds, half of the duration, it has traveled half the distance that it needs to, and then the other one comes in. And that is now what's going on the entire time. We have now snow falling here. What we would do, of course, remove the background colors in this situation. And also what we would do is remove the overflow from being visible to hidden. And here we go. So we have snow falling now at a constantly always going on. Let's go into our final example, and that is with those 3 boxes here. Those 3 boxes we want to slide in when the page is loaded. And we want them to slide in from this location, right outside the box, right here. So they shall be located right here, and then they shall come in to the location that we have given them already. So where they are right now. And in order to get them here, the best way to do that always is to bring them left 100%. All the boxes shall be here from the left. And in order to have access to that property left, we of course need to take those 3 boxes out of the flow, position absolute. And in order to 100% that this refers to this location, which is outside its parent, therefore of course the parent once again must be positioned relative. So that is the setup that we are dealing with here. We are just having here a container box with 3 green boxes inside it, and those ones we now want to bring in from the outside when the page is loaded to the location where they are right now. So the location where they are right now, I have given them already. These are just left values, meaning left 10% relative to the parent. 10% of the parent is right here. 37% is right here. 64 is right here. That's the location of the boxes at this given point. Let's go for the animation, the name we need to supply, and a duration as well. And here I've already included the keyframes for the animation with the name sliding boxes. And inside here we now set up the keyframes. What keyframes do we need? The boxes are at the location where they shall be at the end of the motion. And at the beginning of the motion, they shall be located right here, left 100%. So therefore, at the beginning, we need a keyframe, of course, at 0%. And those keyframes we wanted here to be left, all of them, 100%. And that is exactly what happens. Now overflow, let's set the overflow to hidden here as well, so they are not visible once they are coming in. One thing, it's not very nice, that look how that is happening right now, since it's not very realistic. All of these boxes are starting at this location, but all of them are going to their location over a duration of 1 second. But to consider, this box has to travel the farthest distance. This second box does not need to travel that far, neither does the third box need to travel that far, and also they are coming in all at the same time, so wouldn't it be better to just give that second box a delay and also that third box a little bit of a delay, and then they come in, so a little bit later, slightly. So therefore, let's give them now a delay, but actually the second and the third box. So a delay, the second box shall have one of 400 milliseconds. So let me just cut this out, since this is the first box, this is the second one, and the third box shall have a delay of 800 milliseconds. So let's take a look what happens, and that looks much better. There is only one problem, since now we have a delay period, meaning during a delay period, that means the motion has not yet started, and when the motion has not yet started, then the element just looks like as we have defined right here, since there is no motion going on. But we can tell the browser, as we have seen, during a delay period already look like as the frame as defined inside the frame at 0%. So in this case already be outside the box, and that is what we can define by using animation fill mode with backwards. Fill mode backwards. So we want to start already have that look at 0%, and now that gives us that effect. Looks much better than it did before. One more comment I want to make in regards to this example, and the delay I have applied on the boxes itself. I have given these three boxes always an identity. The parent has a class, and here first of all I have selected the parent and then all the div elements, meaning all the three children, and I've given them settings that apply to all of them. And then individually I have selected them and I have given them the settings that only apply to them individually, of course. And the animation delay is overwriting the delay that is going on here. Animation delay, here the default value, if we don't specify anything, is 0 seconds. So always something, of course, to pay attention to is specificity, that we don't cross into a specificity issue. So in this case, these have identities. That's 100 points. Here we are dealing with 10 plus 1 point, that's 11, meaning 100 points will always overwrite whatever is specified here, meaning animation delay is overwriting the 0 seconds. So it's just something that I wanted to mention as well. Specificity is always sometimes an issue here, and so we immediately know what's going on, why things may not be working as expected. So this was our last example in regards to animation. Now let's take a look actually at the differences, or when would we apply an animation or a transition. Now we have discussed already a couple of times now, and we have seen it, that with animation that we have the control within the duration of how, in how the elements shall look like. So as for example with our bubble we had 3 different locations here. With our Santa Claus we had even 9 different keyframes that we applied. So here it's absolutely clear, since with animation we do have that control, here we would go for animation, since that control we do have. However, we know with transitions with JavaScript, we could, for example, with JavaScript change the CSS values. Whenever the CSS values change, we can do those changes with transitions over time. But just in general, what we could do in JavaScript, we could change just the CSS values over time, every 1/10 of a second, for example. And the values to which we change it to is the background, different background position, different width, different height, and different left value. And that we do, and we do that every 1/10 of a second. And that ultimately also gives us that effect. But it would just be completely ineffective. An ineffective way of doing things, much more code involved. So therefore animation would be the solution. So it's not always, most of the time, animation and transition, both, actually always of the time. With animation and transition we can accomplish both situations. But one is the effective solution and one is the ineffective. So whenever we have really further looks within the duration, such as with our center and with our bubble, then we go for animation. Then secondly, now our second example and our third and fourth example with the snow and with our boxes right here. Here we didn't make use of further keyframes, only one. We went from one look to another. As it always happens with transitions, we go from one value to another. And when we go to another value, if we change it once again, but here we didn't make use of further keyframes. But still, we went for animation because we wanted to have, in regards to the snow, we wanted things to happen an infinite number of times. And that is only what animation can provide us with. It has this property that can make that happen. So first of all, when we want control within the duration in terms of how the element looks like, and also when we want a control that only an animation property can provide us with, then usually in almost all circumstances, it's animation that we would make use of. Now in regards to our next example, our last one that we have gone over, our sliding boxes, here that one we could of course accomplish as well with transitions. But here again we have made use of the fill mode. So those boxes, they already occupy their final location, but at the beginning of the motion, they shall start right here and have the look as if they were right here. So however, let's go into exactly the same example with transitions. And in this case, because we cannot start things here and go and bring things to the original look, let's just start here at 0%, not just start here immediately and then go to the current location. So let's take a look at this setup, exactly the same. I've given them a class of slide. And now when the mouse, when we are applying now a little bit of JavaScript, then as soon as the page is loaded, things just change. All that's happening here is the CSS values change. And whenever the CSS values change, then things can be done with transitions over time. So what I'm doing here, I'm adding just a class to the first box. To this one, I'm adding a class, to this one as well, to this one too. So without, JavaScript is irrelevant for us. I'm just adding here a class and they already have some values. So it's then changed from 100%, where they are right now, it's being changed to 10, to 37 and 64. So just to once again indicate us, it's really sometimes always we can go for both options. But one makes sense to use, the other usually it always makes sense when to use one or the other, due to the effective way of accomplishing things. So when we have control, when we want control within the duration, and also when we want a feature that only animation can give us by the properties that we have there, then we go for animation, otherwise it's transition. Now let's take a look at the other way around. So what I've given here, I have applied an animation to our drop-down menu here. Let me scroll up to that location where that is going on in the drop-down. So here when the mouse is hovering over it, of course we can also apply an animation. And that is exactly what happens. Drop-down, I've given it 100%, it shall have then that max width of 400 pixels. Exactly the same example, just using an animation now, the same example that we have used last week for transitions. Now by default what would happen here is the animation, of course, once it finishes, it goes back to the original look. So we can tell him to stay at 100%. The point here, however, is once we are now, let me reload the page. Once it's at its original look, if we go away with the mouse, it immediately goes away to its original look again. Immediately. Now with transitions, we have seen when we apply it on the element itself, it goes back in the same way as it has gotten there. And that is the difference. So transitions would absolutely make use in such a scenario, even though we could actually also accomplish this effect when the mouse goes away again, due to the fact that in JavaScript we have, when the mouse leaves, then just do an animation once again. So it's really always usually the effective, how effective is one way or the other. And that here we can see always usually when we are going really to another stage, without making use of other properties that animation can give us, and without making use of controlling what is on within the duration, then it's animation. Otherwise, usually it's the transition property. And for us, since we don't yet know JavaScript, another feature would be, or in general, it's actually another feature when the page is loaded. So that also affects things, but as we know, transitions can also be applied in JavaScript to any event, when the page is loaded as well. So there's quite a large gray area, but animation for further control, transition for really changing from one look to another. Now, for next week, we are going finally into transformations, because that is the week that I have actually already announced in week number 14, in which we started with shapes and effects. Now, next week, we will rotate things, skew things, scale things up and down, and therefore we can create different and other shapes and effects as well. However, I decided to bring transitions and animations, which are both animations, so to bring that in between, because then we have more examples to work with in regards to transformations. Often it is the case that we would do things, transform things over time, such as scaling things up and down or rotating things. So therefore I decided to put them in between. So next week is 2D transformations, and then the week after is 3D transformations. So we are continuing with effects and shapes.